My name is Fiona Slater, and I was 34 the night my fiancé's family tried to buy my silence for the price of my own name. It happened at the rehearsal dinner in a country club dining room with 60 guests watching when my future mother-in-law slid a folded document across the white tablecloth and said loud enough for the back tables to hear that I should sign it because I was a gold digger who brought nothing to this family. I read every line of it. I picked up the pen, and they all leaned in, certain they knew exactly how this ended. They thought the folder sitting in front of me was empty. What I did next with that pen already in my hand, and why my father-in-law at the far end of the table nearly came out of his chair, is the part none of them ever saw coming. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the quietest woman at the table is usually the one holding the whole thing up. If a story about being underestimated by the people who owed you the most has ever kept you up at night, you're among friends here. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe, because to understand that pen, you have to go back to a truck, a pair of gloves, and everything I taught myself to hide. I own a company called Slater Grounds, commercial landscaping and snow removal, the kind of work nobody photographs. 12 years ago, it was one used truck, a secondhand mower, and me answering the phone in a parking lot. Now it's 40 trucks, 90 employees, and contracts across 3 counties. Hospitals, corporate campuses, the interstate medians. The state pays us to keep clear. When it snows at 2 in the morning, my crews are the reason people get to work. That business made me a wealthy woman, though you'd never guess it to look at me. I drive a 2009 pickup with a dented tailgate. I wear the same flannel shirts I wore when I was 22 and broke. My hands are rough because I still get out and pull weeds when a job runs behind. Money for me has always been something you build and then keep quiet about. I learned that young, and I learned it the hard way. Every time someone in my life found out what I had, something changed in their face. The math started. The asking followed. Friends turned into people with a proposal. A boyfriend once told me I made him feel small, then made sure I felt smaller. So I got good at looking like I had nothing. I paid for things without flinching and let people assume the flinch was there. I told myself it was humility. Really, it was armor. I had learned that the fastest way to lose people was to let them see how much you had. And for most of my life, that armor worked exactly the way I wanted it to. Then I met a man who never once asked me what I earned. The armor started with my grandmother. She raised me after my parents stopped being able to. She cleaned other people's houses for 30 years and never once acted like it made her less than the people whose floors she scrubbed. She had a pair of leather work gloves, cracked and soft from use, that she wore for everything: the garden, the gutters, the old lawnmower she kept running long past its time. When I was small and complained that we didn't have what other families had, she would hold up those gloves and tell me something I didn't understand until much later. "Worth isn't inherited," she said. "It's built. You make it with these and nobody can take it back across the table." She died when I was 19, and she left me almost nothing anyone could deposit. She left me the gloves. I started the company 3 years after her funeral with those gloves in the truck's glove box, and I've carried them to every important day of my life since. They were in my pocket the day I signed my first 6-figure contract. They were in my pocket the day I paid off the last loan. They still smell like her if I press them to my face, which I do more often than I'd admit to anyone. I built everything I have with my own 2 hands because the woman who raised me showed me how. That's the part the Ashfords could never have understood, sitting in their club with their name on the library wall. They thought a person's value came stamped on them at birth. My grandmother taught me It came off your hands. I met Ethan Ashford in a parking lot at 6 in the morning in 8 inches of fresh snow. He taught history at the high school my company plowed, and he'd come out early to help shovel the walkways before the buses arrived, which no teacher was paid to do. I found him doing it wrong, hurting his back, and I showed him the right way to throw snow so it doesn't come back on you. We talked for 20 minutes while my crew finished the lot. He didn't ask what I did for a living exactly. He asked what I liked to read. When I told him, he lit up and named a book I loved, and we stood there in the cold, arguing about the ending until his fingers went white. He was gentle in a way I wasn't used to. He wore a coat that had been mended at the elbow and didn't seem to care. He looked at me like I was interesting, not like I was a set of numbers he was trying to add up. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I had to shrink. I didn't feel the armor click into place. I gave him my number, which I almost never did, and I told myself it was because he taught history and had kind eyes. Really, it was because he'd spent 20 minutes with me and never once asked the question that always ruined it. He never asked me what I was worth. 2 years later, I understood why. In his world, they only asked that question about people they'd already decided to reject. I knew the name Ashford before I knew Ethan. Everyone in the county did. It was carved over the entrance to the town library, and it hung under the oldest portraits in the Historical Society, men in high collars who'd owned the mill before the mill closed. The Ashfords were what people in that town meant when they said old family. Not rich exactly, in any way you could see. Placed, seated. The kind of name that got you a table without a reservation and a nod from people who didn't nod. Ethan carried it like a coat that didn't quite fit. He'd left the family orbit on purpose, taken the teaching job his mother found beneath them, and built a small life that was entirely his own. When he was with me, he seemed lighter, like a man who'd set something heavy down. "It's why I love you," he told me once early on. "You have no idea who my family is, and you wouldn't care if you did." I laughed and said he was right. I didn't care about the portraits or the library wall. But I noticed even then how carefully he said my family, the way you might name a weather system moving toward the coast. I asked him once what it had been like growing up inside that name. He got quiet. Then he said something I filed away and didn't understand for a long time. "There's nothing more expensive," he said, "than a family that has run out of everything but its name." I thought it was a poet's line. I didn't know yet it was a warning or that I was about to walk straight into the middle of it. The first dinner was at the family lake house, a big shingled place that had clearly been grand once and was tired now in ways I noticed and pretended not to. Margaret Ashford met me at the door in pearls, in a smile that could have cut glass. She held my hand a second too long, looked at my clean but unremarkable coat, and asked warmly who I did the gardening for. "I work in landscaping," I said. "You mean you work in landscaping," she said, the way you correct a child's grammar, and the smile never moved. At dinner, Ethan's sister Vivian leaned in with the interest of a woman conducting a survey. "And what does your family do?" she asked. "Are they local?" "My grandmother raised me," I said. "She's passed." "Oh," Vivian said, and let the silence do the rest. They were kind the way a closed door is polished. Every question had a floor under it, and the floor was always the same. "Where do you come from? And is it anywhere I sit there?" With a company that plowed half the county under my own name, and I said, "None of it." I let them think the truck in the driveway was all there was. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table, like he was proud of how well I was taking it. I told myself I was being gracious. The truth is uglier and older than that. I was doing the thing I always did. I was making myself smaller so they wouldn't have a reason to send me away. I was auditioning, and I didn't even know the part was already cast. Here's the thing I have to make you understand, because otherwise none of what I let happen makes sense. I didn't want the Ashfords' money. There was no money to want, though. I didn't know that yet. What I wanted was the table. I wanted to belong somewhere that had been standing before me and would go on standing after. I grew up with a grandmother in a rented duplex and no cousins at holidays. No big, loud family that argued about football and pasta dishes. I built a company because I was good at building things out of nothing. But you can't build a family out of nothing. You have to be let in. So when Ethan took me back to that snowy parking lot on our anniversary and got down on one knee with a plain gold ring he'd saved 3 months of a teacher's salary to buy, I didn't think about his mother. I thought about a place to belong. I said yes before he finished asking. I said yes to him, and in my heart, I thought I was also saying yes to them, to the portraits in the library wall, and Sunday dinners for the rest of my life. That was the wound talking, though I couldn't hear it then. A woman who has always been outside a door will do almost anything to be waved inside, even shrink, even hide, even sit quietly while people who owe her nothing decide over cocktails whether she's worthy of a chair. I said yes, and I drove home that night happier than I'd been in years. I had no idea I just handed them the one thing they knew how to use against me. Margaret asked to see the ring, the way a jeweler asks to see a flaw. She turned my hand toward the window, light studied the modest gold band, and said, "How practical," in a tone that made practical the worst word in the language. Then she got to work. Within a week, she'd appointed herself the planner of a wedding I hadn't asked her to plan. It would be at the club, of course. The Ashfords had always married at the club. The guest list would be handled by her because there were people who had to be invited, people whose grandfathers had known Ethan's grandfather. When I mentioned I'd like to invite my crew, the men and women who'd built my life with me, she smiled and said, "We'd see about space." Everything I wanted was a thing we'd see about. Everything they wanted was already decided. I watched a wedding that was supposed to be mine turn into a performance of a family I was allowed to attend, but not to alter. And I let it because pushing back felt like giving them a reason. If you've ever sat at a table where your welcome came with a list of conditions, you already know the sound of that particular silence, the one where you swallow the thing you meant to say. Stay with me here because that silence is about to get very, very loud. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and hit subscribe because the algorithm hides these stories from the exact people who need to hear them. I told myself I could earn my way in if I was patient enough. I was about to learn. The door had a different purpose than I thought. What followed were the tests. Nobody called them that, but that's what they were. Small, constant, deniable. At the next dinner, Margaret watched which fork I reached for and corrected me with her eyes before I touched the wrong one. When I mentioned a movie I loved, Vivian said, "Oh, that's fun," in the voice you use for a child's drawing. When I spoke, Margaret would wait a beat and then repeat what I'd said in slightly better English, as if translating me for the room. I've negotiated contracts with men who tried to bury me in fine print, and I've never felt as managed as I did at that table. Each little correction carried the same message underneath: patient and total. You are not one of us. You can visit. You cannot stay. And the cruelty of it was that none of it was loud enough to name. If I'd said, "Your mother keeps insulting me," Ethan could honestly have said, "She was just talking about forks." That was the design. Death by 1,000 forks. I started dreading the drive to the lake house. I started rehearsing sentences in the truck, trying to sound like a person they wouldn't need to correct. I, who'd never rehearsed a thing in my life, who once told a county commissioner exactly where he could put his lowball offer, sat in my own truck, practicing how to be smaller. I didn't see it happening. That's how it works. It doesn't feel like disappearing. It feels like manners. It feels like love, even like the price you pay to be let in. And every dinner, without knowing it, I paid a little more of myself across that table. I finally said something to Ethan on the drive back one night. Not an accusation, just a small, careful truth. "Your mother doesn't like me," I said. He sighed the tired sigh of a man who'd been managing this weather his whole life. "She's like that with everyone," he said. "Give her time. She'll warm up. Just don't give her anything to hold on to." I asked him what that meant. Don't give her anything to hold on to. You know, don't make waves. Let her run the wedding. It's easier. I looked out the window at the dark trees going by and felt something I didn't have a name for yet. I'd wanted him to say, "She is wrong about you, and I'll make her stop." Instead, he asked me to be quieter, to fit into a smaller space, to hand his mother the wheel so the ride would be smooth. And the terrible part is that I understood. He'd spent 36 years learning that the way to survive Margaret Ashford was to give her no edges to grip. He wasn't betraying me. He was teaching me to do what he did, but I didn't want to survive her. I wanted him to stand in front of me. He kept asking me to be smaller, and I kept getting smaller, and I told myself it was love. That night, I lay awake and finally let the thought finish itself. The man I was going to marry had never once in 2 years stood between me and his family. He loved me in every quiet way there was. He just couldn't seem to do it out loud. And I was starting to wonder what would happen the day quiet wasn't enough. Vivian invited me to coffee. Just us girls to get to know each other before the wedding. I should have known better. She arrived with a leather folder and a smile, and spent the first 10 minutes being warmer than she'd ever been. Then the questions started, and they were not the questions of a woman getting to know a sister. Where did I live exactly? Did I own or rent? Ethan mentioned. I had a truck. Was that for the business? How many people worked for me roughly? Was it just seasonal? She was mapping me. Every answer went into that folder behind her eyes, and I could see her doing the arithmetic, the same arithmetic I'd spent my whole life dodging. But it was running backward from what I expected. She wasn't trying to find out how much I had. She was trying to confirm how little. She wanted to establish on the record that I was a woman with a truck and a seasonal job and no family and no money. A woman who could only be marrying Ethan for one reason. I gave her small, true, incomplete answers and watched her decide I was exactly what she'd come to prove. Yes, I said just a truck, just a small operation. I let her write the story she wanted. I don't fully know why. Part of it was the old armor, the reflex to look like less. Part of it was something colder and newer, a sense that I was being investigated, and that whatever they were building, I didn't yet want them to know what I actually was. I drove home, certain of one thing, that coffee hadn't been a welcome. It had been discovery, and discovery is what you do before a trial. I heard the word for the first time through a door I wasn't supposed to be behind. It was another dinner, and I'd gone looking for a bathroom in a hallway I didn't know, and I heard Margaret's voice from the study, low and certain the way she never sounded in front of guests. "We need to protect the family," she was saying. Vivian's voice answered something I couldn't catch. Then Margaret again, clear as a bell. "She's clearly after what's left. A gold digger plain as that. Some women see a name and they smell an opportunity." I stood in that dark hallway with my hand on the wall and didn't move. Gold digger. The word sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. I'd spent my whole life so afraid of being wanted for my money that I'd hidden it from the world, and here was a woman deciding I was a thief for money I'd never touched and didn't need. But it was 3 other words that kept me standing there in the dark. After what's left. What's left you don't say what's left about a full account. You say it about a draining one. You say it about the bottom of something. I turned it over and over, that strange, revealing little phrase, and for the first time since I'd met the Ashfords, I felt the ground shift under the story I'd been told about them. They had a name on a library wall, and portraits in the Historical Society, in a lake house going tired at the seams. And somewhere in that study, the matriarch of it all was guarding what's left. I went back to the table. I smiled and I started very quietly to pay attention. I didn't get angry. Anger is loud, and loud is what they wanted. Instead, the next morning, I did what any business owner with a functioning brain does when she hears the word thief said about her by the family she's marrying into. I called my attorney. Not to attack anyone, to protect what I'd built. I told her I was getting married, and I told her what I was hearing, and she said the thing lawyers say that sounds cold until you've needed it. "Fiona," she said, "you have a company worth 8 figures and no protection at all. We fixed that before the wedding, not after. So we started. We kept my business assets clearly separate. We drafted a prenuptial agreement of my own, one that protected Slater Grounds, my properties and my investments, the things I'd made with my grandmother's gloves in the glove box, from anyone who might one day decide they were family property. I've watched too many women hand over everything they built just to keep the peace, and I decided I wasn't going to be one of them. If you've ever been made to feel greedy for wanting to keep what was yours, tell me in the comments and hit subscribe, because what I did with that document later is the whole reason I'm telling you this. I signed nothing that day. I just made sure that whatever the Ashfords were planning, I wouldn't walk into it with empty hands. I put the folder in a drawer and tried to forget it was there. I told myself I was being careful, not suspicious. I didn't yet know I'd need it. I didn't yet know they were about to hand me a reason. I found out what what's left meant on a Saturday at the lake house, looking for a powder room and opening the wrong door. It was the study, Margaret's private room. And I stepped in before I realized where I was. The first thing I saw was the wall. There was a rectangle on it, a clean, bright rectangle, in the middle of faded paneling, the exact shape and size of a large painting that was no longer there. I knew that shape. It's the ghost a picture leaves when it has hung somewhere for decades, and then suddenly has not. Around the room, there were more of them. Pale wounds where things used to be. A cabinet stood open and half empty. And on the desk, not hidden, just sitting there, the way things sit in a house where no guest is ever supposed to wander, was a short stack of mail. The top envelope had a bank's logo and a red stamp across it that I could read from the doorway. Past due, due. Under it, the corner of a glossy sheet, the kind auction houses send. It said, "For appraisal." I stood very still, and without deciding to, I closed my fingers around my grandmother's gloves in my coat pocket, the way I do when the ground isn't steady. And the whole story turned over in my hands like a coin. They hadn't looked down on me because I had nothing. They'd looked down on me because I had something real and growing in mine, and they were quietly, desperately running out. The portraits and the pearls and the name on the library wall were a beautiful front on an empty house. Margaret wasn't protecting a fortune from a gold digger. She was hiding the absence of one, and she needed a thief in the room so no one would look too closely at the vault. I backed out of that study and pulled the door shut and stood in the hall holding those gloves. And for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't afraid of them. After that door, every insult I'd swallowed changed flavor in my mouth. The correction of my forks, the survey over coffee. How practical about my ring. It had never been about protecting a legacy. There was no legacy left to protect. It was about controlling the story in the room, keeping everyone's eyes on the poor, unsuitable woman Ethan had dragged home so nobody would count the empty spaces on the walls. And the strangest thing happened as I understood it. I stopped hating Margaret and started against my will to see her. Later that same visit, I passed the study again, and the door was cracked and she was in there alone. She'd taken down one of the empty frames and was polishing the glass over nothing, her hands moving in small, careful circles. And her hands were shaking. She didn't know I saw. She would have died before she let me see. I understood watching her that 40 years ago, she had walked into this family the same way I had from somewhere with less, and they'd measured her at the door too. She'd spent 4 decades learning to be a wall, so smooth, nobody could ever grip her the way they'd once gripped her. She wasn't the author of the cruelty. She was its longest-serving employee. She was terrified of the red stamps of the empty frames of a town that still nodded at the name and would stop the day it learned the truth. I felt something I hadn't planned to feel. Not forgiveness. Just recognition. She and I were more alike than either of us would ever admit. The difference was only this: she had a name and no money. I had money and no name. And one of us still believed that made me the one who brought nothing. You'd think, knowing what I knew, that I would have left, that I'd have looked at the empty frames and the shaking hands and the word gold digger and walked out with my company and my dignity intact. I didn't, because I still loved Ethan, really loved him, the gentleman from the parking lot who argued about books until his fingers went white. And because I still wanted the table, even a table in a broke and frightened house, I still wanted a place at it. That's the part I'm least proud of and most honest about. Knowing they had nothing didn't cure me of wanting them. It just changed what I was afraid of. I decided I wouldn't use what I knew. I wouldn't walk into a dinner and announce that I'd seen the past due notices, that I knew the vault was empty, that the whole grand performance was held together with pearls and nerve. That would have been cruelty for cruelty. Their game played back at them, and it would have won me nothing I actually wanted. I didn't want to defeat Margaret. God help me, I still wanted her to like me. So I kept the secret, and I kept my folder in its drawer, and I kept showing up smaller each time, hoping that if I was patient and good and quiet enough, the door would finally open on its own. I still thought I could earn my way in. I still thought welcome was a thing you could deserve into being. I was about to find out that the door had never been closed to keep me out. It had been closed so they could choose the moment to open it and make sure everyone was watching when they did. The ultimatum arrived dressed as a formality. Ethan told me 3 weeks before the wedding, looking at his shoes. "Mom thinks we should have a prenup," he said, "just to make everyone comfortable. She's having Vivian's lawyer draw something up." I asked to see it, and when it came, I read it twice to be sure I understood what I was holding. It was not a prenup in any fair sense of the word. It was a surrender. In the event of divorce, I would leave with nothing. Worse than nothing. The document defined everything I brought into the marriage as family property held in trust by the Ashfords. My business, my properties, the things I'd built with my own 2 hands before I'd ever heard the name Ashford. They wanted me to sign my life's work over to a family that was hiding red-stamped envelopes in a study. And the beautiful, insane logic of it was this. They still thought I was poor. They thought Slater Grounds was a truck and a seasonal job. This whole crushing document was designed to protect their non-existent fortune from my non-existent one. They were reaching across the table to take assets they didn't believe existed from a woman they'd decided was after theirs. It would have been funny if it weren't aimed at the one thing in the world that was truly mine. I sat with that document a long time. I didn't call my lawyer. Not yet. I wanted to see how far they'd take it. I wanted to see if the man I loved would take it there with them. I put their prenup in the same drawer as my two folders side by side, and I waited for the Ashfords to show me exactly who they were. I gave Ethan the chance to be the man I hoped he was. I laid their document on our kitchen table flat, where he couldn't pretend not to see it, and I asked him one question. "Do you know what this says?" He read it. I watched his face waiting for the anger, the flush the moment he crumpled it in his fist and said, "Absolutely not. You are not signing this." That's not what happened. He read it, and he got quiet. And then he said the words that ended something between us that I'm not sure ever fully came back. "Just sign it," he said. "It's only paper. You and I both know we'll never get divorced, so it doesn't matter what it says. Sign it and make her comfortable, and then we can just be happy." I looked at the man I loved across my own kitchen table and understood that he was asking me to sign my grandmother's gloves away to make his mother comfortable, to hand over everything I had on paper so that a woman who called me a thief could feel that she'd won. "It's only paper," he said, the way people say things when they've never had to build anything, and so can't imagine losing it. It wasn't only paper to me. It was every early morning in the snow. It was my grandmother's hands. And the man who was supposed to stand in front of me had just asked me to lie down. I kept my voice level and my hands still. I told him I'd think about it. And that night, I understood finally and completely the thing I'd been running from my whole life. Nobody was ever going to hand me a place at the table. Not even him. That night, I couldn't sleep. And so I did the thing I never let myself do. I looked straight at my own life. I saw a girl in a rented duplex learning that the way to keep people was to need them and never to threaten them. I saw a young woman hiding her first real money like a shameful thing. I saw myself paying for dinners and letting the Flint show dressing down, driving a dented truck on purpose, telling every person I loved a version of myself that was smaller than the truth, so they wouldn't leave. And I saw where it had brought me, to a kitchen table at 34, being asked to sign away the one thing I'd never made smaller, my company, in order to keep a family that had never once chosen me. The armor hadn't protected me. The armor was the wound. I'd spent my whole life making myself small enough to be loved, and the smaller I made myself, the less there was of me for anyone to actually love. So I made myself smaller, still feeding the thing I was starving from. My grandmother didn't raise me to be small. She raised me to build. She wore those gloves like a crown. And somewhere along the way, I'd taken everything she gave me and hidden it in a glove box, ashamed as if worth were something to apologize for. I lay there in the dark, and for the first time in a very long time, I stopped apologizing. In the morning, I called my attorney, and this time it was different. Last time I'd been protecting myself out of fear. This time, I was doing something quieter and harder to name. I asked her to prepare a full financial disclosure. Everything, the real numbers, the company valuation, the properties, the investment accounts, all of it laid out plainly on paper for anyone who cared to read. And I asked her to finalize my own prenuptial agreement, the one that protected what I'd built, and to add one plain page of legal fact at the front. She asked what I was planning to do with it. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't know yet. I only knew I was tired of being the poor woman in a story other people were writing. If there was going to be a document on a table, it wasn't going to be only theirs. My lawyer walked me through the law, calm and precise, and I wrote it all down. A prenuptial agreement pushed on someone under pressure, without their own attorney, without full and honest disclosure of both sides' assets, is not worth the paper it's printed on. It can be thrown out. It protects no one. A fair prenup, she said, requires both people to show their real numbers in the open, with time to think and counsel to advise. Their document did none of that. It was a piece of theater, and bad theater at that. I put my folder together, the disclosure, my agreement, the one page of law, and I set it by the door. I didn't know if I'd open it. I only knew I wouldn't walk in without it. Vivian let it slip the way people let things slip when they want you to know and can't admit they want you to know. We were confirming numbers for the rehearsal dinner, and she mentioned lightly that it would be a full room, 60 people. All the important ones, she said. Everyone will be there to witness you joining the family. She smiled when she said it, and the smile had teeth. I went home and sat with that sentence. Witness you joining the family. 60 people, the important ones, and I understood what the rehearsal dinner was going to be. It wasn't a dinner, it was a stage. They were going to hand me their document in front of 60 of the oldest names in the county at the exact moment when refusing would look like the tantrum of an ungrateful gold digger. They'd chosen the audience on purpose. A woman alone at a kitchen table can say no. A woman surrounded by 60 watching faces in a white dress one day before her wedding with the man she loves looking at her. Hopefully, that woman is supposed to be too ashamed to refuse. Public was their weapon. Shame was the pen they meant to put in my hand. And sitting there, I realized something that surprised me. Public could work the other way, too. If they wanted 60 witnesses, they were going to get 60 witnesses. But not to what they had planned. I didn't decide to humiliate them. I want to be clear about that because it matters to how this ends. I decided only that whatever happened in that room, it was going to happen in the light, and I was going to be, for the first time in my life, exactly my full size. The night before the rehearsal dinner, I sat alone at my kitchen table with two things in front of me. My grandmother's gloves and the folder by the door. I didn't rehearse a speech. For once in my life, I didn't practice being anyone. I just sat with the quiet and asked myself what I actually wanted underneath the wanting to belong, underneath the 2 years of shrinking. And the answer when it came was simple, and it cost me something to say even to an empty room. I wanted to be able to look at myself. That was all. Not to win, not to destroy them, not even any more to be let in. I wanted to walk out of tomorrow, able to face the woman who'd built 40 trucks, out of one the woman my grandmother had raised. Everything I'd done for 2 years had been a slow trade of that woman for a chair, and I was done trading. I picked up the gloves and held them to my face and breathed in the leather, in the memory, and I made myself a promise in her voice. Whatever happens tomorrow, I will not walk into that room as anyone smaller than I am. I didn't know yet if I'd marry Ethan. That's the honest truth. I loved him, and I didn't know. I didn't know if a man who could ask me to sign away my life, to soothe his mother, could ever learn to stand in front of me instead of beside me while I bled. But I knew one thing with total clarity, sitting there in the dark with the gloves against my cheek. I was done auditioning. The part had never been mine to earn. And I was finally, after 34 years, going to stop trying. The club was beautiful in the way a stage set is beautiful if you know where to look. I looked. The flowers on the tables were silk, not fresh, dressed up under the lights, so most people wouldn't notice. There were half as many staff as a room that size should have. The chandeliers had been dimmed to a flattering gold that also conveniently softened the worn spots on the carpet and the water stain near the ceiling. 60 of the oldest names in the county sat at round tables in their good jewelry, and every one of them believed they were dining in Old Money's house. I knew better now. I knew the whole room was held up with nerve and silk flowers and a name on a library wall. Margaret worked the room like the performance of her life. Radiant, gracious, touching elbows, calling people darling, Vivian orbited her. And at the far end of the head table sat Gerald Ashford, Ethan's father, a quiet man I'd barely heard speak in 2 years. He was watching me, Not the way the others watched me, with the polite arithmetic, but the way you watch weather you're not sure about. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. And something in his face was almost like an apology he didn't have the courage to make out loud. I took my seat. I set my small clutch in my lap, and inside my coat, folded flat, was my folder. Their document was already on the table, tucked under Margaret's place setting, where she thought I couldn't see it, waiting for its moment. The gloves were in my pocket. 60 people lifted their glasses, and I understood that the dinner had already begun and that everyone in the room was about to get exactly what they came for, just not the way they expected. It happened between the salad and the toast. Margaret tapped her glass with a spoon, and the room went soft and attentive, the way rooms do for a woman like her. She thanked everyone for coming. She said a few gracious words about family, about legacy, about the importance of protecting what generations had built, and then, still smiling, still radiant, she reached under her place setting and drew out the document, and she slid it across the white tablecloth until it came to rest directly in front of me. "There's just one small family matter to attend to first," she said, and her voice carried to the back tables the way she'd trained it to for 40 years. "Fiona, dear, before you join this family, we need you to sign this." She let a pause open, and into that pause, so that not one of the 60 could miss it, she said the thing she'd been wanting to say to me for 2 years. "Sign it, gold digger. You bring nothing to this family." The room didn't gasp. It did something worse. It held still. 60 of the oldest names in the county sat with their forks halfway up and their eyes on me, and I could feel the verdict already forming on their faces, the old easy verdict about the woman with the truck and no family who had reached too high. Ethan had gone white beside me. Vivian was watching with the small, hungry stillness of someone who'd waited a long time for a show. And Margaret stood over me, gracious and merciless, holding out a pen. I looked at the document in front of me on the tablecloth. Then I looked up at her, and I did the one thing she wasn't prepared for. I smiled, and I picked up the pen. I didn't sign. I read out loud. Calmly into the silence of that room, I began to read their document to the 60 witnesses they'd so thoughtfully assembled. In the event of dissolution of the marriage, I read, "The party of the second part shall relinquish all claim to assets and shall convey any and all property, business interests, and holdings brought into the marriage to the Ashford Family Trust." I paused and looked up. "That's me," I said. "The party of the second part. Everything I bring signed over to your family forever. Is that right, Margaret?" Her smile flickered just slightly because this was not the script. In her script, I was supposed to be crying by now, or fleeing, or scrawling my name in shame. Instead, I was reading her own weapon back to her slowly so everyone could hear exactly what the gracious Ashfords were asking of the woman they'd called nothing. I kept the pen in my hand. I let them all watch me hold it over the signature line, and I felt the whole room lean in 60 people, certain they were about to watch a gold digger sign her surrender. Ethan whispered my name, half a plea, half a warning. Margaret's chin lifted in something like triumph. And Gerald, at the end of the table, set down his glass very carefully, as if he'd seen something the rest of them hadn't. I let the moment stretch until it was almost unbearable. The pen poised the room, holding its breath. "It's a generous document," I said quietly. "It really does account for everything I'm bringing to this family." Then I set the pen down on the tablecloth next to their document, and I did not sign it. And into that confused, breathing silence, I reached into my coat and took out a plain manila folder and laid it on the table in front of me. "There's just one thing it's missing," I said. I opened my folder the way you open a door you've kept locked for a long time without hurry, because there was no longer any reason to rush. I took out the first page and laid it face up on the tablecloth where the light could reach it. What it's missing, I said, is the other party's disclosure. A fair agreement shows both people's numbers. So let me show you mine. I began to read, still calm, still quiet, and the numbers filled the room like water filling a low place. Slater Grounds, I read. Commercial landscaping and snow removal. 40 vehicles, 90 employees, contracts in 3 counties. And then I read the valuation of my company, and somewhere behind me, a fork touched a plate and stopped. I read the properties I owned outright. I read the investment accounts. I laid each page down as I went face up a plain paper trail of a life built by hand, and with every page the arithmetic in that room ran backward and then broke. These were not the numbers of a gold digger with a truck. They were the numbers of a woman who could have bought the club, the lake house, and the name on the library wall and had money left for salt. You said I bring nothing to this family, I said, and I looked up at Margaret, whose face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Let's read what nothing looks like. And at the end of the head table, Gerald Ashford, the quiet man who was the only person in that entire room who actually knew what the family accounts held, put both hands flat on the table and half rose out of his chair staring at my pages. Because he understood before anyone else in that room what those numbers meant. He understood that the woman his wife had just called nothing was the only solvent person at the table. He understood which family in this marriage had been marrying up. He rose and he caught himself, and he sat back down slowly, and he did not take his eyes off me. Here's where they thought it ended. They thought I'd slide my own document across the table, now the way they'd slid theirs, and crush them with it in front of 60 witnesses. Take the empty house, and the red-stamped envelopes, and the shaking hands, and hold them up to the light. It would have been easy. It would have been fair, even. And it would have made me exactly what they said. I was someone who came to that table to take. So I didn't do it. I took out the last page of my folder, my own prenuptial agreement, the one that protected everything I'd built, and I didn't read it to the room. I simply laid it down and said quietly, I brought a document too. Mine protects what I made from anyone who ever decides it's theirs. I was going to sign it and marry into this family anyway, because I wanted to belong here more than I wanted to be safe. And then I stood up. I stood up in front of 60 of the oldest names in the county at my own rehearsal dinner, and I set the pen down for good. I'm not going to sign yours, I said to Margaret, and I'm not going to marry your family. I never was. And then I turned to Ethan and said the truest thing I'd ever said out loud. I'll marry you at the courthouse Tuesday, with nothing changing hands but a promise and no one's name on it but ours, or I'll wish you a good life and go build mine. But I'm done earning a seat at a table that put a price on me. Choose now, Ethan, not for her, for you. The room was utterly silent. I'd just given up the wedding. I'd dreamed of the family I'd shrunk myself for 2 years to join, and quite possibly the man I loved, all in one breath standing up. And I want you to understand something. For the first time in my entire life, standing there having lost all of it, I felt exactly my full size. Ethan stood up. For a long moment, he looked at his mother, and then he looked at me, and I watched 36 years of learning to be smooth war with something braver underneath. Then he did a thing I'd never once seen him do. He walked around the table past his mother's outstretched hand, and he came and stood beside me, and he took my hand in front of everyone. Then he turned to Margaret and said in a voice that shook and held anyway, "You just showed me exactly who values what in this family." And Margaret, who'd run that room like a stage her whole life, finally lost the performance. Her composure cracked, and the truth came out of her in a hiss meant only for me, but loud enough for the front tables to hear. "You have no idea," she said, "what it costs to keep this family's name." And for just a second, I did feel it. The 40 years, the empty frames, the shaking hands. A woman who'd been measured at a door once too, and had never stopped bleeding from it. I didn't hate her, but I didn't sit back down either. Gerald caught my eye from the end of the table and gave me the smallest nod, a quiet man's apology and blessing at once. I picked up my folder and my gloves and walked out of that beautiful, dimly lit, silk-flowered room with my hand in Ethan's. My full size at last. We married on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. I wore a simple dress and my grandmother's gloves folded in my pocket. Ethan wore his good coat, the one with the mended elbow. Two of my crew stood as witnesses, the men who'd built my life alongside me, the ones Margaret would have seen about space for. There were no silk flowers and no 60 faces doing arithmetic. There was just a clerk and a promise and nothing changing hands. But Gerald came. He stood at the back of the little room alone, the way he'd watched me across the head table, and afterward, he took my hand in both of his rough old ones and held it a moment. "We were the ones marrying up," he said so quietly. Only I could hear. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it out loud. Margaret did not come. I didn't expect her to. And I found standing in that plain, bright room that I didn't need her to. The table I'd spent 2 years trying to earn my way into had turned out to be a stage in an empty house, and I'd walked off it, finally, into a marriage that had my full size in it and room to spare. It was the smallest wedding in the history of the Ashford name. It was the first honest one. The lake house sold that autumn. The name stayed carved over the library, the way it always had been, but the town learned soon enough what had been hiding behind it, the way towns do. I didn't lift a finger to save the Ashfords, and I didn't lift a finger to sink them either. I let them keep their name, and their debt, and their empty frames, and I stayed out of it because their story was no longer mine to write. Slater Grounds took on 2 more counties that year. Ethan kept teaching history and learned slowly how to stand in front of me instead of beside me while I bled. We bought a house with money I'd made with my own hands, and we put both our names on it, separate and clear and honest, everything in the open, the way a fair agreement is supposed to be. He never once asked me to be smaller again, and I never once in that house had to pretend I was less than exactly what my grandmother raised me to be. I hung my grandmother's gloves on the wall of my new office, framed in the spot where the light hits them first in the morning. Not hidden in a glove box anymore, not shameful, not small, right out in the open where anyone who comes to talk business can see them. Cracked and soft and worth more to me than every painting that ever hung in the Ashford study. Sometimes, early before the crews roll out, I stand and look at them, and I think about the empty rectangle on Margaret's wall, the ghost of a thing she sold to keep a name, and I think about the thing I hung up in its place. She spent her life defending a wall with nothing behind it. I spent mine ashamed of everything I'd built. In the end, only one of us learned to put her worth where the light could reach it. Here's the only lesson I took from all of it, and I give it to you plainly. Worth isn't something you inherit at a table someone else sets. It's something you build with your own 2 hands, and no one, no matter whose name is carved over the library, gets to slide it back across the tablecloth and call it nothing. That's my story. A folder I almost never opened. A pen I picked up then put down. And a name I finally stopped trying to earn. If anyone ever made you feel like you brought nothing to the table, go count what you built with your own 2 hands and count it out loud. Do it today. And if this story reached you, share it with a woman who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.